From the time we reported suspected child abuse on March 16th to June 10th and then to October 22nd, that's how long they took to make the initial report. So that was published October 22nd, 2015. The second time it was reviewed was November 23rd. That's the time we got the letter. And the third time was Dwayne Early, who was told about all of these things. And the fourth time was with Paul Davis, where they tell us they have closed the matter. So that is the history of the stonewalling of the report, all the times I have shared with them. So if you think to yourself, is this fair? I think it's very fair. They've been told in private over and over again they need to take a second look and to make things right, and they have chosen not to. Scrolling by are the 11 professional references ABWE chose for this report. These are their professional references. So before we get into the references, I just wanted to go through this. I've got 7 kind of slides, if you will. ABWE's conclusion, ABWE's core values, ABWE's statement of commitment, ABWE's missionary lifestyle and holiness, integrity defined, the not defending Caleb statements, and then the interview questions that I have here.
Integrity is a word with deep moral roots in human history. Many philosophers, psychologists, and anthropologists believe that this notion to attach moral meaning to our actions is actually what distinguishes us from other animals. But what exactly do we mean by integrity? The word has 2 definitions. The first definition is the quality of being complete, unbroken, or whole. And the second definition, which is more important for our purposes, is the quality or state of being of sound moral principle, honest and sincere. Being of sound moral principle implies that a person has developed and lives by a certain code of ethics that includes honesty and sincerity. These 2 moral virtues are cornerstones to human interaction.
On March 23rd, Phil McMillan sat with us, and these are the minutes that Barney Robeson wrote down. And I call these the 6 not defending Caleb statements. So we're talking about a stiff arm in football. And Phil says a stiff arm is a common play in football, and I say I disagree. And Phil McMillan says a stiff arm is a common play, but I'm not saying that as a defense for Caleb. 2, my wife says, what do you do with an 18-year-old you cannot control? And Phil McMillan proceeds to tell us that, well, real children aren't developed completely until they're 23. Then Phil proceeds to tell us that the template of a bully is a composite, and my comments are not the beginning of an excuse-making for Caleb. 4, bullies are not always bullies at heart. 5, third culture kids, child counseling, but this is not saying I'm enabling Caleb. And then 6, we need the right decision. Then, on March 25th, Phil proceeds to defend Caleb. There is no bullying. There's nothing here to see. The real problem is me, Dan Byram. So on June 26th, Tim Hepworth, with Nancy in the room, asked me the question, what were you told the reason you were going home? And, of course, it was my anger. He's like, your anger? I'm like, yep, my anger. He's like, not your son's anger? No, not my son's anger. That is the story. The topic we're talking about is physical abuse, emotional abuse, and bullying. That's the topic we're talking about. 11 different experts in their reference section. So that's what we're going to touch on now.
Practically every performance of any kind now, they have to give an etiquette lesson. You go to the movies and it says, turn off your cell phone, don't do this, don't do that. So the new toy theory. And you've probably never heard of it, and so therefore I can do anything I want with it.
I wanted to give back to relationships, so I wrote a book called I Only Say This Because I Love You.
My man Picky tonight.
That's about adult family. And it is parallel way to chapter what everybody wants to talk about is good.
because I've not heard about this at all before. Okay. It's known as huffing, and it's on the rise, according to a new study by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Adi Jaffe from UCLA, addictions researcher, is here to tell us more about it.
The way a lot of kids start out is glue, paint thinner, gasoline is another common one.
October 22nd, 2015, ABWE publishes out the report, and the topic is child physical abuse, emotional abuse, and bullying. Now look at the experts that they are citing. Judith Martin is a journalist and a film critic. Deborah Tannen is a PhD in linguistics. Daniel Kehoe is a PhD in communications. John Sheldon Reed, a sociologist, essayist, writing on the South. He also has some cookbooks. And then my personal favorite, which is Adi Jaffe, a PhD in drug addiction. These are the experts that are writing zero, absolutely nothing whatsoever in any way, shape, or form about child abuse, emotional abuse, or bullying. This is just complete nonsense. So they quote Judith Martin in some defense against bullying. They quote Deborah Tannen in some quote about the USA and South Korea and how the older children are like the USA and younger children are like South Korea, and somehow the older children have to keep themselves in check or something like that. And then they talk about communication, and that communication has to do with, well, what the listener heard, what the listener thought he heard, what the speaker said, what the speaker thought he said. I mean, it's complete nonsense. And then you talk about John Sheldon Reed. This guy would be mortified to find out some book he wrote ended up in a child abuse report because of talking about culture. This is what I want to touch on right now, because this part of the report is the crux of the matter, where ABWE is going to switch their focus and say, oh, the whole problem is the child. So when you look at this, you realize that they actually did a Google search, and that Google search is of correlation and causation. And they found an article that said correlation and causation, and they plopped it down in this report without ever actually reading the article. And this article is actually talking about, as you look at it, marijuana use, methamphetamine use, smoking drugs, and how it affects people's lives. And ABWE actually puts this in the report as found on August 19th, 2015 as their psychology, that they know what they're talking about. Correlation doesn't prove causation. When researchers find correlation, which are also called an association, what they are saying is that they found a relationship between two or more variables. For instance, in the case of the marijuana post, the researchers found an association between using marijuana as a teen and having more troublesome relationships in mid to late 20s. And they talk about marijuana smoking and methamphetamine. That's the entire article. This is absolutely malpractice. Now consider that ABWE wrote this report and published it on October 22nd. Dr. E. Alan Cockrell tells me they reviewed the report on November 23rd, but no one read anything about this bogus quoting of an addiction specialist. And then I talked to Dwayne Early, and I go over all these things, still not caught. And then it goes to the Child Safety Committee again, still not caught. They aren't interested in anything they've written down at all. They're simply interested in their conclusion. They should have just said, start to finish, we're not writing a report, our conclusions are valid no matter what. That is how poorly this has been handled from start to finish, and they can't admit the crazy, stupid, asinine, absolutely backward, idiotic, poorly done world they live in. So this is from page 8 in the actual report, Indicators of Bullying. And it says, indicators by themselves are not evidence of abuse. Child Welfare Information Gateway, 2013. The child isolation withdrawal from social interactions are not in themselves evidence that he was bullied. Correlation does not prove causation. Jaffe, this is when they actually quote that article as correlation does not prove a causation. They haven't read the article. But these indicators should cause the adults in the child's life to ask questions about what is going on in his life. It is essential that we ask the question, were there other issues in the child's life that could have been contributing factors or in themselves caused these behaviors? They're trying to figure out what would cause a fist fight other than a stiff arm in the face that caused the fist fight. That's their idiotic thought process. ABWE rejects the idea that there could possibly have been any bullying, any physical abuse, or emotional abuse. And so what do? They're going to try to figure out what would cause a child to act a certain way. Why would he avoid Caleb like the plague? And then their arguments are things like, well, the child is not like the Gambia or Gambians. Well, he has avoided contact with the Gambians. Most of his time was spent in either his house or his school. When the child played sports, it was with his sister and the Lippy children. He did not play sports with the Gambians. Spending time with Gambians would have helped him to appreciate them. The child usually responds to development that he did not like within a sporting event was withdrawn to his house. This was not a response of fear, which would be displayed by someone who had been bullied, but rather a response of anger. That's pretty lame science, I gotta tell you. The child displayed a pattern of avoiding Caleb, really. He would refuse to participate in some events if Caleb was going to take part. He brought anger with him to the Gambia. He kept it in his pocket. ABWE is trying to figure out what would cause a fist fight, but it can't be a stiff arm in the face in a two-hand touch football game. It can't be that. It can't be bullying abuse. It doesn't exist. It can't be. So it's got to be one of these other things. And this is basically the narrative that is published throughout all of this. Good missionary kid versus bad missionary kid. The good missionary kid loves his environment. He loves being in the Gambia. He loves it all. And the bad missionary kids, well, they just don't love it here. So they're the bad missionary kids. That's what this narration is all about. So there's 4 definitions that they're working with here, and that is preponderance of the evidence, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and bullying. Those are the 4 definitions. ABWE's standard for this report, okay, so the preponderance is based on the agreed upon opinions of those writing this report. Physical abuse, the way they're using it, must be intentional and must cause damage. Emotional abuse must be a caretaker only, a caregiver. Bullying must be intentional, must meet their criteria of more bullying or not enough bullying, and is only defined as a physical event. Bullying cannot be emotional, it cannot be psychological, it cannot be mistreatment or bad words. It can only be physical. The true definition: preponderance is based on the more convincing evidence and its probable truth or accuracy, and not on the amount of evidence. This standard requires the plaintiff, that'd be us, to prove based on evidence and witness testimony presented that there is a greater than 50% likelihood that the defendant caused the damage or other wrong. I think it's pretty obvious that the last 3 videos show that there's a whole group of people telling a whole bunch of lies. Under the preponderance of the evidence, they have indeed designed and participated in physical, emotional, and bullying. Under the physical abuse portion, I want you to look at this and understand that the red lettering is the things that ABWE omitted from the report. So even though it says 1, Appendix B, page 1, note 3, physical abuse may be defined, is left off the report, and all it says is any act that results in a non-accidental physical injury. But the difference is that the use of maybe is expressing possibility, where the versus the concept of must, which would require necessity. And they're implying a must, so they're changing the standard to a higher standard to protect their narrative. And then also in Appendix B, page 1, paragraph 2, line 2, or exploitation of children under the age of 18, or 3, Appendix B, page note 10, including inappropriate physical or emotional behavior putting children at risk, or a violation of the code of conduct putting children at risk. But more importantly, according to the Child Act of 1989 regarding the threshold criteria for child abuse, defining harm as ill treatment or the impairment of health or development. Development means physical, intellectual, emotional, social, or behavioral development. Health means physical or mental health, and ill treatment includes sexual abuse and forms of ill treatment which are not physical. But ABWE doesn't like that definition, so they don't use it. To emotional abuse, ABWE has a quick 3-step process. 1 is to be an emotional abuser, usually you're some type of caregiver. And since that didn't fit, so 2, we're going to choose a definition that says you have to be a caregiver. And then 3, Caleb wasn't a caregiver. It's simple as that. And so then 4, we're going to defend Caleb. He was a minor until January 14, 2015, so with all his interactions with 2 Byram children, was when he was a child, so this doesn't even fit the definition of emotional abuse. He can't be an emotional abuser. However, Nancy Hepworth tells us, when she's speaking to us in September, that back in March, and these are her words, and then the issue of bullying, that is more of an emotional abuse issue, and our policy says these matters are handled by the regional administrator. So we just referred the whole thing. This was the child safety team, met the 24th of March, so we referred the whole thing to Phil McMillan. So in March and September, the definition of emotional abuse is different than it is in October. Isn't that interesting? The allegations of bullying, you've got basically four things you want to look at here. First is it basically says in the report that Keith and Michelle Lippy first heard the allegations of bullying at the mediation meeting March 12, 2015. The argument there is that since it's the first time it was brought up, it must not be valid. Two, ABWE does not have a policy for bullying. Not sure why they put that in there. Three, the issue of bullying is more complex than that of emotional abuse. And then four, with a complex definition, they go to simple, as it must, at its most basic level, a bully is someone who hurts someone else on purpose. This is Kaiser, 2007, page 20. October 22, 2015, ABWE's finding on page 4, and I will read this, it says, ABWE does not have a policy to cover physical abuse in a situation in which the aggressor is a minor and the target is an adult. Yet that was the case when the child hit Caleb multiple times. There was injury right away. Caleb's back was red, and later there was bruising on Caleb's back and side. As a result of no policy, there is no institutional process to follow in this situation. That is their finding. The abuser is the child, and the victim is the adult. To break this down, here's ABWE's argument. The physical abuse is true. The aggressor is a minor, as it says. The target is the adult. The standard is injury. They have no policy. There's no institutional process to follow in this situation. That's their argument. ABWE Appendix B, here is the policy and the institutional process to follow in this situation. Step 1, report harassment, March 16, 2015. All reports of harassment will be examined impartially and resolved as promptly as reasonably possible, given the potential international scope of the claims. If an investigation is warranted under the standard of reasonable belief, the VP of Global Operations, in concert with the regional administrator and the area director, will task the legal department with an investigation. Step 2 was not completed after the October 22nd report. It says in the policy, the results of an investigation along with management's suggestions will be reported to the board of ABWE International. If the investigation shows that the report is substantiated under the preponderance of the evidence, then ABWE International will apply the appropriate discipline options. Investigation results will be communicated to the alleged victims, the reporter, and the alleged perpetrators. Problem here. The conclusion, ABWE did not report the findings of abuse to Frank Weirman and Barney Robeson, the Gambian team, or the board of ABWE. What ABWE did was they said there was no abuse, but that's not what the report found. The report found that the minor was the abuser and the adult was the victim.